I just want to say thanks to everyone for coming, and we're in for a little bit of a ride because this trip was really a really good experience for me. I feel like I learned a lot, and I feel like a lot of times when you start learning something, you realize how much you don't know. And so I have like a lot of information in my brain that I've tried to like organize and simplify, and hopefully it comes out that way. Most of what I'm saying is not like research I've done myself. Other experts have actually done it. So just don't want to be claiming anything that's not mine. So in August, I went on a 3-day trip down to the border in El Paso and Ciudad Juarez. And part of the main reason I wanted to go is because of different people I've been meeting in Beaver County in the past like year and a half. Each of these chapter titles is a specific person in a very different situation in Beaver County that I've met. And I'd like to tell you like all these stories, and I'm not going to because that'll just start us off badly with time. But a couple of them is the second one, you're not legal. I was working at a food pantry, and part of my job was helping people apply for SNAP benefits. And one of the first Spanish speakers I helped apply for, so we're going through this application in Spanish, and she had to put down her status. And the one she selected was a term I was not familiar with. And then she brought in her papers that we submitted with the application. She got a letter back saying, you don't qualify because you are not legal. But she had papers. And I looked up the term, and she had a parole status. And I was like, I don't know what that means. But she like got this letter being told you're not legal. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. A friend of mine who I am teaching English to, she's teaching me Spanish. She was a psychologist down in Colombia, and now she is working as a nanny, which she enjoys, but she would really like to be working in the field that she has spent so much time doing, on her education with. And so she's in this like long process of really trying to improve her English so that she can move more into the career path that she like wants to have. And then this last one, at like the beginning of September, I went with a mom and her daughter to her new school that she's going to be attending. Neither of them speak any English yet. So we were trying to navigate like, here's how the pickup process works with the bus and like all these things, trying to understand what we're going to do. And then meeting with the teacher to figure out how is this little girl going to operate in the classroom when she's sitting there supposed to be learning letters and stuff and, doesn't know English yet. And then one of the main things that came up was like, every day they have a school lunch option. And if you don't like it, there's PB&J. And this little girl does not like PB&J. That's not a comfort food for her. So these are just like little snippets of like people in Beaver County who are facing all sorts of complicated things. And I realized how much I don't know. And so when this opportunity came up to go to the border, I was really excited to go and learn more about what's happening. And then, of course, especially with it being an election year, we're hearing all sorts of like storytelling around what immigration means and looks like. Just really quick, what's like a common concern or question that you either have or that comes up a lot when you're hearing about immigration as a political talking point? Jobs, yeah. Safety.
It's pretty negative.
There's a lot of negativity, yeah. Like, is there a safety issue with people coming? Do we have capacity for people coming? Is there a connection with the drugs we know are coming to? Like, there are a lot of questions like that. How are people going to function? There's a wide variety. And something that I'm really hoping that this feels like a conversation starter in and that I can invite you all into is I listened to like a snapshot of a TED Talk by Betty Hart in which she talked about canceling people versus compassion. And she defined that as suffering alongside people. And she said, sometimes we can cancel people when we disagree or find friction. instead of choosing to do the work of suffering alongside people as we're trying to like navigate these conversations. So yeah, so like a lot of questions. I want to like address some of those. And I also just like want to invite you all into having conversations that are in that vein. And that's kind of my hope for myself too. All right, so this is where I went. El Paso, Texas, right on the border, and Ciudad Juarez on the Mexican side of the border. That's both of them in this picture because they're essentially one city cut down the middle. If you zoom in a little bit, if you can see that red X kind of on the left side, that's the Mexican side. So like, it looks like all one city. It essentially used to function more that way, in some ways still does, but now it's got like this border down the middle of it. And just like Google Maps version, they're both like right there, and that's how they operated. So it took us like 10 minutes to drive across the border in the car, and then we like walked back on the day that we went. Some in the past, people very easily lived on one side, worked on the other, went back and forth. Apparently, kids used to kind of like swim in the river, and Border Patrol were like lifeguards a little bit more. And then in the past, maybe 30 years especially, the fencing has gone up, and there's just been a lot more like, it's just a lot bigger deal. We care a lot more about how easy it is to cross and how that operates. This is my quick zoom out. Right now, there's a lot of migration happening globally throughout the world, and a lot of that is refugees and asylum seekers. And the US really just isn't actually at the center of the migration issue. We are like a part of it, but we're not one of the countries that is having a lot of people leave right now, and we're not like receiving a ton of people proportionally. If we were receiving like a proportionate number of people based on our size, it'd be about double the amount of people who are coming right now, which doesn't mean that it's like easy right now, but like this is like a whole global issue that's going on right now. So we're talking specifically about our southern border and who's coming. That's a book I used to read to Jasper and Merrick at their house. Who's coming to our house right now, if we're thinking about it that way. The vast majority of people at the southern border are asylum seekers. And what that means is we have this category of refugee and asylum seeker. From a humanitarian standpoint, they're identical. They're both fleeing persecution or violence or some sort of fearful situation. A refugee just kind of does the process of paperwork outside the country they're trying to get into, and then once that's lined up, then they're like let in. The US has less of that because people have to fly, and we're not gonna let you get in an airplane and come without that lined up. But asylum seekers, the way the process works is you go to the country, you stand on the soil, and you say, hey, I'm scared for my life. Please let me in, and that's when the process starts. So the vast majority of people at our southern border who are trying to come across are trying to step on soil and say, hey, I'm scared, please let me in, and that's when their process will start. Of those people seeking asylum, at this current moment, about 82% of them are from Venezuela. And so we spent a lot of time talking about Venezuela when we were down there because like what's happening, that so many people are coming from like one place. There's a family at the Spanish-speaking church here in Beaver Falls who are from Venezuela. They got a sponsor to come here. And so I asked the 20-year-old daughter, I said, hey, I don't really know much about what's going on, but like, what's happening in Venezuela? And she said, well, it's mostly like the economy. Like you cannot find a job. And if you can, you can't like support a family. And there's like a lot of political corruption going on. If you've read anything about the election happening or that just happened, there's a lot. But so Venezuela for years has been it was the richest country in South America. It's been one of the most stable. It's been the top 20 countries worldwide as far as GDP for years. And then just recently, it has tanked. In 2022, inflation reached 1,946%, which I don't even know how to kind of comprehend how that works. So people are struggling a lot with how to survive. So at this point, 7.7 million have left the country since 2014. And just another note, 6.5 million of those people are elsewhere in Latin America or the Caribbean. So that's not the number coming to our border, but that's the number that are leaving right now. There was an earlier wave of wealthier Venezuelans in the early 2000s. It started getting a little shaky. So people who could afford to said, all right, I'm gonna get my visa, gonna peace out. So there's kind of a large population of Venezuelans in Florida who came a while ago because they were well, it just wasn't stable. But so now people who are arriving at the southern border are people who they couldn't leave before, and now they're I can't take it, I have to try something. And one story from the leader of our trip, she interviews people to kind of hear about their stories. And one woman said, yeah, we were drinking water out of the street. And she was like, what does that mean? And what it meant was they were getting rations from the community center every month of food and water because their water was shut off. And it wasn't enough. So as a community, they started digging a hole in the street, punctured a water pipe, and then started trying to drink out of it. So that's what they were saying, okay, we can't keep staying here. We're gonna try to go somewhere else. So a lot of people who are making it this distance from Venezuela on the right up to El Paso, it's over 95 marathons worth of walking. And that's what came up when I Google mapped the trip. Both walking and driving, it says, sorry, we cannot find a route for you. And the reason for that is this thing called the Darien Gap at the very north of Colombia and at the beginning of Panama. It's this 100-mile jungle that's considered impenetrable because it's so dangerous. It's dangerous because of the environment, temperature, just living through the physical environment, animals that are there, and then areas surrounding it are controlled by guerrilla groups and paramilitary groups that have been trained by the US. And so there are a lot of people that make it very unsafe, and people are choosing to travel through this. And I really wish I could talk more about it because, yeah, it was so scary to hear about. But a couple people that I met who are working there, they have seen so many people arrive to the border, and they said when you look at their eyes, it just looks like they're dead inside, or that something has happened that I can't comprehend. So they traveled to the beginning of this trip. They had a connection with a pastor, and the pastor was very much do not speak English, do not acknowledge citizenship in the US, and you can spend the day with me and just kind of see a little bit what I do. And what this pastor does with his dirt poor church is they cook a meal every day to give to people before they go on this trip, and he begs them to not go. He says please do not go, and the American dream it's not going to be as easy as you think. The trip is not going to be easy. If you survive, the trip will be awful, and I don't know that you're going to find what you're hoping might be true in the US either. And there's kind of a mixture of responses to that. Some people are well, I might as well die trying that than die here. And other people, because of social media and TikTok and lies going around like that, some people get the impression that they're going to be able to have this company guide them through the jungle. And this company is actually guerrilla members, paramilitary groups. We're like, yep, we'll take all your stuff, and then we'll drop you off, rob you, and either leave you or, do like worse things. So yeah, the expectations for what people are about to go through vary. And either way, the experience trying to get through this section of the 95 marathons is just like awful. So yeah, these are not my pictures, but like it's a jungle. And there are a lot of stories of like moms trying to cross a river and their baby gets washed out of their arms, and that's the end, as well as abuse and stuff. And then after, if you survive that, you still have to get up through all these Central American countries and up through Mexico. That includes like train rides. Every single person on the top of that train has paid for their spot there. Like those are tickets, people trying to get somewhere. And there was one gentleman who shared a story of like, it was so cold on top that he would pee himself trying to keep warm while he's on this like rest of this 9 to 5 marathon trip. So that's like, not of course every single person's story, but a majority of people who are currently arriving to our border are having come through something like that if they're coming from Venezuela. And then once you get here, people know that there's like you have an international right to claim asylum in a country. It is considered a human right to show up, step on someone's soil and say, hey, I'm terrified, please help me, and then a process will start to see if you like qualify. Okay, here we go. This is where I tried to condense a whole lot into like one slide, and I'm still trying to figure it all out. So the US agrees with that. Title 8 is where we have like our asylum law, and it affirms that, yeah, you can come seek asylum, but we say you have to seek asylum in a different country first before you come here. So you could arrive to the border and be told, actually, you've got to go backwards a country or two or something, try there first, and then you can come back and give it a go. And then it also has this phrase that it doesn't really explain how you seek asylum here. It says that like that's to be decided at the discretion of the Attorney General. And so it has happened where the Attorney General sends an email with a PDF, and that day, everyone working at the border has to switch how they are, like taking appointments for asylum, how they're like starting this process. And so the way our law is written is like allowing people to seek asylum, but it can switch so easily that people get very easily screwed over. So like if they're not doing it quite right, they might end up getting paroled in. They could end up getting themselves a 5-year ban from seeking help from the US because they didn't do it right. And this issue of parole is also a thing that is at the discretion of the Attorney General. So I mentioned this woman who I was trying to help sign up for food stamps. We applied, and she was told, you don't qualify because you have a parole status, which means you're not legal, which is not exactly accurate. But what it means is if you are paroled into the country, we're saying, we know that you're here, it's fine for you to stay, here are papers, but you don't have a status. And what that means is you can't apply for a work permit, you can't get any government benefits, you're basically like allowed to exist here, and that's it. And you don't have like a right to the government doesn't have to provide you with legal counsel as to what to do or try next. And there are multiple families I met at the food pantry who had this parole status. And that's when I first started learning about it, because I was like, what? I'm not sure how this helps anybody. So you're allowed to be here, but you have no status at the same time. And I don't quite know why that's helpful. So that's like, there's a whole lot in like the process and like ways to try to get in, but those are like the levels of complexity that people are facing when they're after having been through a lot of trauma. Then it's like, okay, I have to figure out the system. And I'm not gonna lie, Chris and I are like terrified that we're doing our taxes wrong all the time, and like, and we don't have like a language barrier, and I don't think we make enough money that the government's gonna care a lot. But I was like, I just can't imagine having so much riding on me doing this process right, and like, I don't know how it works. Like, I don't know how you're supposed to like navigate through it. I wanted to talk a little bit, so like, that's like a lot of like factual information that's really confusing. And something that the leader of this organization brought up, particularly as Christians, was he was like one of the 10 Commandments is don't bear false witness against your neighbor. And he's like, I wonder if we're doing that when we repeat things that we don't know to be true. And so I've been thinking about that a lot and trying to think about like, okay, I know this is really complicated. And so whenever I talk with people, I really want to like not say something if I don't know it to be true. I don't want to repeat things if I don't know it to be true. And if other people are repeating things, I feel like I want to say I at least don't know that that's true, because I don't want to be talking about people in a way that may not be true. And a big reason behind that is because of how much stories shape how we view ourselves and how we view other people. And just kind of as we said, like some of those common stories, like we're getting mail every single day from people. Then a lot of them talk about, here's why this candidate is the best thing or the worst thing ever, and here's a specific topic that we're going to say why. A lot of immigration ones have these kind of stories connected with them. And these are a couple that I know are not true, and I want to like say that. But like a big question people have is, we know there's like a lot of drugs coming into the country from the southern border too. Is that connected to immigrants or asylum seekers who are coming? And what I know now to be true is like 92 to 94% of all illegal drugs that are seized at the border are at ports of entry, which means the place you're supposed to go through. They're primarily coming in cars that have to have papers, that get inspected, but like the cartel knows that only about 1% of cars can really get thoroughly inspected because of the number we're trying to get through for trade purposes. So if you're walking across on foot, even if you're going between ports of entry, the likelihood that the cartel wants you smuggling their drugs is like incredibly low. They're loading cars up with it, with people who have the documentation they need to go back and forth easily. 80% of the people sentenced with smuggling both drugs and people are US citizens. And another 5% are legal non-citizens. So the vast, vast majority is not connected with this issue of people seeking asylum. Oh yeah, and then the second thing that people wonder about is like a safety issue of like, is crime rate connected at all? There was a Marshall Project study done from 1980 to 2016 studying the relationship between the increase of an immigrant population in different cities and violent crime rate. And this is like the overall trend, but in each city, like if you look at it broken down, everywhere that the immigration population went up, violent crime rate went down. And like, they may not be like directly tied, like the amount that it goes down varies a lot. Sometimes it's like barely moves at all, sometimes a lot, but it's at least not a true witness to say, oh, more immigrants are coming, that's why crime rate is doing whatever it's doing. This is like the outside of a monument that we went to honor victims of a Walmart shooting that happened in 2019. And I bring this up because the shooter, whatever stories he was hearing or believing, he believed strongly enough to drive 500 miles to go shoot at people that he believed. I don't know what he believed about them, but he felt he had a reason to try to kill people. And that included a young couple with a baby. The couple died trying to protect their baby. One was a man who jumped in front of his son because his son and his soccer team were there fundraising outside of a Walmart. I believe there were 13 people who died as a result of that shooting. And we spent a lot of time there just kind of like meditating in that space, and also just talking about like the stories that we repeat affects people, and they affect how we view people. And I don't think, my guess is whatever stories the shooter was believing were not stories like this one. That paper says, What Remains. This is like a traveling art project that's happening. La trenza means the braid, and it's like a collection of all these items that have been picked up at the border that people have lost. And these are like some of the items, like these are my pictures. Like that's a stuffed gorilla maybe, and like a stuffed bunny, and like kids' shoes. Like the majority of items found, like these are families currently that are arriving, trying to figure out how to get across. And like, yes, there is a reality that there are, like, of course, there are some people who come and do commit violent crimes. Like, I'm not trying to deny that. But if we're talking about numbers, there's a lot more like families coming than maybe the couple stories that get retold around like immigrants being violent or bringing drugs or bringing weapons. And I even talked on the airplane ride back with someone. He was like, oh yeah, my buddy's on Border Patrol, and there's like all sorts of people coming across with like violent, like criminal backgrounds. I said, oh, how do you know what their backgrounds are? And he said, you can't really till they come and start causing trouble. And I was like, so I don't think you actually know that people are coming with criminal, like, I don't think you're knowing that. And then especially looking at like this Marshall Project that showed like crime rates, I was like, I don't think that's actually true. And I wish I'd handled that conversation better. All right, we also spent this section talking about Scripture, because these are the stories we're claiming that influence us the most. And like pretty much all the main characters in Scripture had to migrate at some point. Abraham and Sarah had to migrate because first God told them to, which the US wouldn't have accepted as a good reason to come. But then also there was like a famine, so they're like forced to leave and then come back. Also with Sarah, we see kind of like a vulnerability of women on the trip because everyone was like, hey, there's a person on the move, and she's pretty. Joseph was literally trafficked by his brothers. And then Moses' mom, I feel like we often think of like, wow, can you imagine having her faith to put her baby in the river when she had no other option and didn't trust him to God? There are moms at the border floating their babies across or their kids across, or I know of like a 3-year-old, a 5-year-old who picked up by the fence because parents are like, well, if kids get picked up, I know that they'll keep them inside and I know that they'll give them food. Like at least that's my best shot. Then we have Joshua, who literally led a migrant caravan through a desert into like a new land. We have Ruth, which we often paint as like a romantic story, but it's like much more about a woman whose country experiences a famine, so she migrates to another place. Then her whole family dies, basically. And then Ruth chooses to migrate back with her, not because she's got hope for a future, but out of love for a family member. And then, of course, we have Christ, who technically was not a refugee. He was an asylum seeker, because they went on foot, fleeing violence, someone trying to kill him, and going down to Egypt and saying, can we stay here in order to survive? There's also just the fact that, like, all throughout Scripture, the main 4 groups of people that God, like, mandates Israel as his people to care for are the poor, the orphan, the widow, and the foreigner. And he literally says, like, remember that you were foreigners, so this is the posture I want you to have towards foreigners. And this was the story that like stuck out in my head, because we talked about the book of Obadiah, and I knew that I read it at some point, because, you know, I've read through the whole Bible. But I was like, yeah, I couldn't tell you a thing about Obadiah other than that's the name of a book in the Bible, and at some point I read it. But this is modern day Petra, which is where Edom was, which is who God's talking to through Obadiah. And these aren't like the same structures. This is just like modern day. But it was basically, they lived in the mountains and carved homes out of the mountains. And so God, Edom is the descendants of Esau. So they're neighbors of Israel, kind of related to Israel, and have had beef with Israel for years. And then this is happening when Babylon comes and is taking Israel into exile, which God mandated. You know, God like told Israel, you're in trouble, so your time is up now. I'm punishing you by going into exile. The way the Edomites responded, there were kind of like 3 things that they did. To one extent, they were just kind of indifferent about it. That's happening over here, and we're here. In some cases, they were a little bit like, well, we never really liked them, so, you know, it's all right. And in some cases, they would apprehend people fleeing and turn them over to the Babylonians. And I would encourage you to go just read the book of Obadiah, because just knowing that little bit of background, I was like, oh, I see it through the whole thing. The book of Obadiah is God being livid with Edom that they are responding in this way to their neighbor's downfall. So it's like God mandated that Israel would go into exile. And when Edom is feeling kind of good about that, God says, no, I'm angry with you, and this is going to happen to you too now. Like, this is not the response that I'm looking for. And that story has just been like replaying over and over in my head, particularly as I'm thinking about and learning about how much like Venezuela was doing so well, and just like a very quick collapse happened. And I just never really, like, I've said in my head, like, oh yeah, that could happen in the US, but like I've never really kind of felt that was true. And it's like, oh yeah, that like happens. It's like countries collapse. And how we respond to it matters. And if my country collapsed, I would also kind of hope that maybe I'd have somewhere to go in which people were at least like willing to work with me to figure out, I don't know, something. So that's been a story I've been going over and over in my head. Okay, I'm going to wrap up with just this. And please, if you want to talk about any of these more, like, there's like so much that I've left out, and so maybe it probably feels really discombobulated. But yeah, there's just like a lot going around in my brain all the time about it. But so I have all these group of people I met that I mentioned at the beginning in Beaver County, and just trying to think about like, all right, this is where all of us are here. I don't think we're like planning to move to the border and operate down there. But like, what does compassion or suffering alongside people look like here in our context? Obviously, we have a week and a half till we can vote, and just like trying to listen to like what are people at different levels saying about both policy and the stories that they're sharing around this issue. And kind of going along with that, I'm just, personally, I've been trying to be very thoughtful about the stories I'm sharing And then if someone else is bringing up a story, am I willing to say, like, I don't know if that's true. Maybe you're not wrong, but like I don't want to be endorsing something that I don't know to be a true story. And then the fact that we have like a Spanish-speaking church here in Beaver Falls even, I would encourage you to say like we have like literal neighbors, and this is something I'm trying to work on more too. Spanish church is somewhere that you could go to meet people. They're trying to do cultural events at the cultural center. Attending those, I do know that I think that the Beaver Falls Christmas Parade, they're going to have a posada celebration as part of it, just to kind of be sharing about a traditional Latin American Christmas tradition. But yeah, there are like events that are easily available. And if most of you were forced to take high school Spanish, you could try to brush up on it and try to like, do like a basic conversation. But yeah, essentially like what's a way that I can be a neighbor to someone who's actually here. And I've mostly found that like conversations quickly get awkward, particularly with a language barrier. And every time that I choose to like not leave when I've run out of things to say, usually something good happens in that scenario. And this will just be the last story I share, but when I was in Ciudad Juarez, we went to a shelter and we were celebrating the graduation of a group of women from like a program they finished while they were in this shelter. And this one woman was like really glad that we were there celebrating with her. She also shared that she said like, I know that hope is really important and I like need to have hope to keep going, and I don't really know how to have it sometimes. And then when she found out I was pregnant, she was like over the moon for me. And so like I've been thinking a lot about how close suffering and celebration are together just in life, like all the time. And she and I have super different backgrounds. I have not dealt with I don't even know what all she has had to deal with in her story, but clearly we're in different scenarios. We're in the same place for very different reasons. But we had this like human connection of like, we've both been pregnant. And that was like something she was not just like, oh yeah, I did that. It was like, oh, I'm so happy. like she was so happy for me and she doesn't even know me. So I guess I just say that to encourage too, like we have neighbors here who are specific people with specific stories that are probably very different than ours. And at the same time, there's going to be a lot of shared like humanity. And so just trying to find ways to like bridge those. That was a lot of all over the place. But thanks for like listening to it. And if you have specific questions now, I can do my best. But also I would just love to like keep having conversations too. So that's
What was the organization that you went with?
It was called, so the organization that hosts these encounters is called Abarra, which means like ford or crossing point. And that was a whole section I didn't talk about. They picked it because of the specific location that they're at. Like historically, a lot of indigenous people would travel at this like ford part of the Rio Grande River and travel up and down. And we kind of went through a whole history of that specific area, like indigenous people, and then when like people were moving out west, what slavery looked like there. But yeah, that's kind of where they're founded. Abada is the name of the organization. So, yeah.
How did living in Mexico City for a summer prepare you?
I think what was most noticeable about that is like, I recognized a particular gas station when I was in Ciudad Juarez. I was there, I was like, oh, it's an OXXO. They're like, those are everywhere in Mexico City. Like to some extent, like there are a ton of people in Ciudad Juarez who are also not trying to like get across. It's just that's my town, that's where I live, and, everything's normal. So I think that was interesting, just, like, that was, like, one of the first things I noticed was, like, oh, I'm, like, simultaneously seeing stuff that's, like, really crazy, and also this is, like, a normal place. So, as well as my Spanish got better from that, so that helped. But yeah. We got to talk, a lot of the information I shared came from someone who worked for about 26 years for Border Patrol, both in DC and like all along the border. And yeah, he kind of shared a lot of information of like stuff switches really easily. And he even said too, like, he was like, I know a lot of people who work on Border Patrol, and like they do interact with people. They have a very human interaction. And yeah, and those are the people whose jobs can switch from a PDF sent in an email from the Attorney General, be like, okay, we've got to do this now. So yeah, I would say it is really, I don't know if there's anyone who feels super clear on how it's like supposed to go. Because the laws that we have written don't specify that. So it's like, all right, here's what we have in place, and that can like switch really easily. Yeah.
Can you
Yeah.
explain what's happening with the wall across the border?
Yeah, I didn't really talk about that at all. So they always called it a fence when we were down there because it's not an actual wall, it's like a fence. And the purpose of the fence is to like direct people toward ports of entry, or if people are trying to get across, trying to like just slow them down until like an officer can get there and be like, hey, what's going on? But there are large sections that are not fenced, either because it just doesn't make sense with like the terrain that's there. It's like, yeah, we don't really need a fence there because it's like not worth it. And also there are a lot of people who own private property and they're like, I don't want this on my property. So yeah, even administrations, like I think Trump said he put up about 500 miles of new fencing. About 50 miles of that was where there wasn't already fencing. Most of it was just doubling up because they actually can't find more spots to put it because people are like, I don't want it on my private property, or it doesn't make sense with terrain and things. So yeah. And there have been measures more put in place trying to, all of the fencing is on US soil. So the idea is you actually don't have to jumping the fence is not a very common thing, because the point is you walk up, if you're by the fence, you're on US soil, and you can say, hey, and a lot of people will go up to a fence and just wait for Border Patrol to come pick them up and say, hey, I'm here, please, can you let me in? I'm like seeking asylum. So that's some of the things around that. And there have been some more things of putting in place trying to keep people from stepping on US soil, and that's where like barbed wire in the river and like stuff comes in. And it's like confusing because it's like that's not technically illegal to do because we don't really have it written out as to how someone seeks asylum, but also people are allowed to like come seek. So that's where it gets like confusing and sticky, is like, all right, so that's not illegal, feels a little inhumane. But yeah, everyone's trying to figure out, how do we make this a process that's manageable? And yeah, a lot of people like who are applying for asylum, they'll spend about 4 to 8 months waiting to get an appointment. And often that appointment then is like 6 months out. And so but you can't stay at a shelter that long. So a lot of people are in like a holding pattern in Ciudad Juarez and like other cities, kind of like trying to figure out. And a lot of people will go up to the fence then as like, they're like, I don't have time, so I'm just gonna like turn myself in, which doesn't really help them in the long run. And also not sure what else to do. Yeah.
You mentioned there's a lot of other countries that have immigration, mass immigration, and America's
Mhm.
as far as proportionately the amount of people we're taking in.
Yeah.
What kind of like legal structures do those countries have in place? And are there any example countries that do immigration well that we could look to as an example?
I don't have an answer for that. I don't know what other people's processes are, and my impression would be is I don't know if other countries are doing it better, but other countries have a lot more proximity to places where people are being displaced, so it might just be a little bit more like more in a situation of they're like a ton of people all here like lined up. What are we gonna do? I would really love to know if someone has a good system in place, but I don't actually know that. So yeah.
With the parole status,
Mm-hmm.
okay, you just mentioned that it lasts like 6, 8 months.
Not parole status. I'm pretty sure that parole you have like a year, and then something has to switch, either leaving or you have a year to like get the asylum process starting or like waiting on that.
Now,
But
once
yeah.
you're in that parole status,
Mm-hmm.
you had said that, like that one woman, her result came back, you're in parole status, you're not eligible because you don't have an actual title.
Right.
Now, once they get placed different places, like here in Beaver County, for instance,
Yeah.
are there other resources that can actually help them?
So if you don't have a status, there are no government benefits that you can get, which is why a lot of people like were at food pantries, because the specific one I was at too is like you had to sign up, but you didn't have to like prove your income or anything. It was just based on like self-declaration. So that's I think why a lot of families on parole are at food pantries, because that is a resource that's available to them. As far as I know, there might be more, but yeah. But government-wise, yeah, you have to you can't even be in process of seeking asylum in order to qualify for any government benefits. Yeah, you have to have already received the approval for being an asylum seeker or a refugee. So yeah, it's kind of a stuck spot. Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so there are like 3 ways that you can enter the country. You can have a visa of some kind, whether a work visa or a travel visa or something. Same as like I needed to go to Mexico. I had to have a visa in order to go. You can, and that would be like a refugee visa as well. Like they have those. You can get like paroled in, saying like, okay, we see you, we're gonna let you in while you're figuring out this asylum seeking process status. You're considered illegal if you enter without inspection, which means you did not go to a point of entry, you didn't like turn yourself into someone, you somehow did manage to get across the fence and you're like here without any sort of documentation. And those numbers are like really low because of how difficult it is to get across, and because most people are seeking asylum, so they're like, no, I want to turn myself in so that I can be in this like process. So illegal, if you're here illegally, that means you entered without inspection. And then where it gets dicey is like parole, you don't have a status, but it's not illegal for you to be here because we said you could. But I think parole status maybe gets confused a lot with that because you don't have a status, but it's also not illegal. So that's what? Yeah, it's very much a limbo spot. But yeah, if someone is here illegally, it means they entered without inspection and like have not been encountered at all. And that likelihood that's like a very small number. Yeah, sorry.
Your asylum is at the discretion of the Attorney General.
Mhm.
Granted mercy or asylum.
Mhm.
Do they do like a background check of Mexico, where you come from? How do they pass your inspection?
Yeah, so like if you're seeking asylum, you have to have an appointment in which you go and they do this whole interview process in which you have to basically make your case for why you're afraid to be in your home country and that sort of thing. Specifically background checks, I am not sure what that looks like exactly. But it's a pretty thorough like interview process. And a lot of the difficulty that people will have is if you've been through a lot of trauma and you're being asked to retell that story in a pretty sterile environment, a lot of people will like kind of get scrambled on timelines. So the one woman who's leading our trip, what she spends a lot of her time doing is interviewing people in Mexico, talking with them in their native language and trying to use trauma-informed practices to understand what their story is. And then she will write it. And then she's like, I can't give you legal advice, but this is the story you've told me. If you want to turn this in like for your interview, trying to make that process a little bit easier rather than being in an environment with an attorney who has to ask certain questions and then dealing with a language barrier. I don't know background checks specifically, but I do know that that's the first step in this process of kind of being vetted and determining if you qualify for asylum.
Do you know what the percentage is of people who do obtain asylum and those who are returned?
Yeah, one question that I have, oh good, we have 5 minutes. One question that I wanted to reach out to this one woman that we met is, sorry, percentage. She told me that she works in El Paso and her first piece of advice is for someone to leave El Paso and try to do the process somewhere else in the US because the denial rate is like 90-some%. And I wanted in El Paso. And I wanted to ask her, like, is that just because we're so overwhelmed because there's not time to go through them and so time just kind of runs out and we say no? Why is it more likely in other places? So that's a question I still wanted to communicate with her about. So I only know that in El Paso, like the denial rate's pretty high and then people are asked to leave. So, yeah.
Did you talk to some people that came up to the fence? Did they realize that some people, that we want them in the United States and there's people who want to really harm them? Did they understand where we're coming from here? Did you try to talk to them?
Yeah, I did talk with a couple people. I don't really know what their impression is of the general U.S. population, if people are accepting or not. Yeah. Yeah. I don't really know that.
Crazy we are here in the United States at some point.
I don't know. Yeah, I'm not sure what
they're fighting for their life.
Right. I'm not sure, especially like when you're still in your home country, I'm not sure what the impression is like. And I don't know how far, yeah.
But do they realize what they're jumping into?
I think probably a lot of people don't. Yeah.
Always be negative with people all the time.
Yeah. One thing I just remembered too that related to your question, Kristen, the vast majority of people who are currently illegal in the U.S. are not because they entered illegally. It's because they probably like overstayed a visa or something like that. Because of the difficulty in actually getting in without some sort of inspection, those numbers are like almost zero. Most people, it's like, shoot, I haven't renewed this in time, or I didn't know I had to, or parole ran out and something ran out. That's the vast majority of people who are currently illegal, is because they got permission to come in and then overstayed because that paperwork didn't get done for one reason or another. I forgot about that. Yeah.
So people examine these people that make it through the asylum process.
Mm-hmm.
What does it look like after? Like once they get asylum, like what does that mean now?
Yeah, so once you're told, okay, you qualify, you are an asylum seeker now, or an asylee. That means I think you still have to wait like 6 months till you can apply for a work permit. Because the one family that I know in the Spanish church, they got a sponsor to come here. So like they had an easier trip getting here. They did get qualified as asylum seekers, and then they had to wait 6 months to get a work permit. Once you have a work permit, then you've got the legal like number you need in order to apply for jobs and like and like get a job that's going to be recognized and be able to start kind of living normally a little bit. So that's kind of, once you get that status, then you can start applying for you can start like living more normally and applying for benefits if you're looking for that or doing that. And then there's a lot more freedom to like move in the country too. If you're on parole, it's really hard to like go anywhere because you have court dates and stuff. So I was just told that my time's up, so I think I'm not supposed to keep you here longer than now. But yeah. If you have more questions, I don't know the follow-up answers, but yeah, this is what I've been mulling over a lot. And we have neighbors who are mulling over it more than I am because they're trying to figure it out. So thanks for coming.
One question that I can ask you, right, Rose?
Mm-hmm.
What are your next steps as a Christian, as a person with this group? Do you have a desire to do more with the group that you went with? Do you have a desire to go back at some point? Do you have any follow-up that you're looking for?
Yeah. So I guess like personally, I'm trying to do more and more with the cultural center that's in town. I'm trying to help develop programming that's geared toward education, both of people who are arriving, like new neighbors who are arriving, educationally, like how to operate, learning English, stuff like that. And then also people who are already neighbors here, just like what does making space and like what does our community adjusting look like? So that's me personally working with like the cultural center, mostly doing like both English and Spanish classes. As far as like SOMA specifically, like there are things we could look into, like sponsoring a family to come, or just finding more ways to like partner with those organizations. I'm kind of open to having any of those conversations. But yeah, I'm definitely feeling like career-wise, I specifically want to be continuing and like learning and educating. And I also got the idea while I was there that like apparently becoming a paralegal is something that you don't have to like go to law school for, but like in this specific area, you can gain a lot of expertise and do a lot of work trying to help people more on the governmental paperwork side of how does this process work. So educationally, I'd like to explore some of that stuff too. And yeah, if other people have ideas of like brainstorming what like SOMA or what Beaver Falls or Beaver County looks like. We've had some conversations with the Genesis Collective about like what role does the arts have in sharing stories, in promoting local artists who are from a different background. There's a woman here from Mexico who's an author. There's a woman here from Venezuela who paints like what does like community life look like as we're transitioning, as the community is starting to like look a little bit different maybe. Those are thoughts, questions, things I'm wanting to pursue. So
could you finish by praying for us?
Sure.
You know, we're receiving and hearing and learning, and just pray for our congregation and our community.
Sure.
In whatever ways you feel like.
Yeah. God, I just thank you for today. I thank you that you are a God who, as John was saying this morning,